Welcome to Through a Glass Darkly Radio with Sean Patrick Hazlett. On welcome everyone. Thanks for coming back. You're listening to United Public Radio. The intro music was "Mark of the Doomslayer" by Carl Casey at White Bat Audio. And today I'm very pleased to announce that Peter Levenda will be joining us. He is the author of Unholy Alliance and Sinister Forces. He appeared in the TNT documentary Faces of Evil in his role as an expert on World War II history, with special regard to the occult and esoteric practices in the Third Reich. He will also appear on the upcoming History Channel special, Nazi Prophecies. Peter has interviewed Nazis, neo-Nazis, Klansmen, Satanists, self-proclaimed witches and occultists, intelligence agents, clergymen, bogus clergymen, businessmen, military officials, and many more during the course of his research for both Unholy Alliance and Sinister Forces. Peter, welcome back, my friend.
Thanks for having me back. Good to be here.
Your bio stumbled me. I kept saying the Yahtzee word. I was trying in real time.
Sorry about that.
Edit it. No, it's not your fault. But I mean, we're going to kind of be talking about some of this stuff, so we're just going to be talking a little bit in code. But so you wrote this book called Unholy Alliance, and what were you trying to achieve in that book? Like, what was the central premise? What kind of research question were you trying to answer?
Yeah, that's a good question, because actually Unholy Alliance was designed initially just to be a chapter of Sinister Forces. And the overall question was, what relationship does the world of politics and governance have with the world of religion and spirituality? In other words, to what extent do religious beliefs or spiritual beliefs affect actual policy in government, not just the United States, but around the world? But Sinister Forces really focused on the United States. We have our Constitution, which guarantees a separation of church and state, that the state cannot make laws concerning religion, and there is no state religion in this country. But we see in effect that we have political leaders who are very religious, and to what extent do those religious beliefs affect how they deal with global issues or national issues? Can we really make a really fine line separation between the two? We see in our country the extent to which religion and religious ideas and concepts dominates political discourse. I mean, more so than it does in many countries around the world, which have long histories of religious activity and religious activism. But they still, when it comes to government is run like an office, right? And there's no room for all the strange beliefs that religious people may or may not have. So one particularly good example of that was Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. And it was like this was a government that had a great deal of motivation. Their policies were based upon some very strange ideas, eugenics being one of them, but a kind of eugenics to its logical conclusion. So there's a spiritual difference between peoples, according to the Third Reich. So these people believe that, there was spiritual pollution present in the bloodlines. I mean, to the extent that if you were an SS officer, for instance, you were not allowed to have any kind of sexual intercourse with a Jewish woman, for instance. That was because what happened is your bloodline becomes polluted, and then you bring that pollution back to your unit. It was a very strange idea. But this is one of the many ideas that they had. And I thought, well, this is a good place to introduce this concept of a church-state, amalgam. And what would it lead to? I mean, the Holocaust basically made no sense otherwise, right? It had to be a spiritual phenomenon, because people who did not even identify as Jewish, who were non-religious, who were secular Jews, were rounded up for this because it was believed they carried this contagion, right? So that's no longer science. Now we're Never Neverland. So I said to myself, okay, this is a good place to look. And then I came across a book by a guy called Ladislas Farago. He wrote a very famous book called The Game of the Foxes, and a book on Patton, General Patton. And he wrote another book about the Nazi underground after the war, and it was called Aftermath. And he talked about a very strange encampment in the Andes Mountains in Chile, which was like a religious Nazi cult center. That's as much as he knew about it at the time. And I thought, hot damn, this is something I've got to see with my own two eyes. This is like perfect. I mean, if I could just see this operation that ties all the threads together. And eventually what happened is that became the core of the book called Unholy Alliance. I came across the documents that captured German records at the National Archives. I came across a lot more, a big stash of them at the Library of Congress, where they have another bunch of papers from the early days of the party and what Hitler was doing with various other individuals that he was getting wiped out. People that had new secrets about Hitler's past, knew about his involvement in the Thule Gesellschaft, which was this weird secret society that kind of gave birth to the Nazi party. So all of that is there. And I'm looking at this stuff and I'm thinking, here's the original documents, but people are writing books about Nazi occultism that are sort of fantasies, right? So you had the Sphere of Destiny, which was largely a fantasy. Very little in that book was factual. And I'm thinking, why are they doing that? Here's the real stuff. And it's unbelievable. It's the Tibet expedition of the SS, and it's all this other stuff.
Yeah. What was that about? Can you just take a detour on that? Like, why was the SS going to Tibet?
Well, it has to do, believe it or not, with the swastika, right? To Blavatsky, right? Who she was writing all of these books about, she created basically the modern theosophical movement. Madame Blavatsky, she wrote The Secret Doctrine, Isis Unveiled. And her symbol for the longest time was the swastika, believed to be the symbol of a super race, of the Aryan race. And this was picked up in Germany in the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. This was hot stuff in Europe. This was like, unbelievably fascinating. It was very popular. And there was World War I. World War I ended disastrously for Germany. But at the same time, communism was starting to take hold in Germany. I mean, it had already happened in Russia. So you had Russian soldiers throwing down their arms, German soldiers saying, we're not going to fight each other. We're brothers, we're workers, we're part of the workers' movement. Why are we killing each other for our bosses, right? So you had now communists coming back, or Germans coming back who are kind of socialist oriented, kind of thinking about communism in a positive way. And then you had the anti-communist forces who had adopted a swastika as their symbol. So you had the Steel Helmet Brigade, a Freikorps, a Free Corps Brigade, which was sporting
Stahlhelm, right?
Stahlhelm, yeah. So you had those guys marching with the swastikas. This is before Hitler had adopted it, right? Or the party had adopted it. So this was already very popular. And when Germany finally got organized around these ideas, what happened was the SS had created, or Heinrich Himmler had created, this little organization called the Ancestral Heritage Research Bureau, the Ahnenerbe. And this was a division of the SS. And he wanted to find evidence around the world that the Aryan race was like the old super race, that you could find traces of it everywhere. And then it was Germany's mission in life to bring back that race and to reinstitute it as the guiding light of humanity. So what happened was, who has the biggest collection of swastikas, right? It's Asia. So it's Tibet, India, like that. So Tibet was believed to be the repository of ancient wisdom, and it would be the ancient Aryan wisdom that the Nazis were looking for. So they sent a famous archaeologist, anthropologist, out to Tibet with a group of SS archaeologists, and they went to Tibet and they visited Lhasa, and they went all over the place, collecting information, collecting data. There's an organization called Tibet House, and there's one in New York, and they're spread all over the world, really. And they have film footage there of the SS expedition as well as a OSS expedition. Because when we felt that Nazis were doing the Tibetan thing, we had to do the Tibetan thing. So the forerunner of CIA, the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, they sent a couple of guys out there to sort of poke around and see what was happening. So you'll see some of their footage as well. It's fascinating stuff. But again, I insist, the stuff is there. It's not invented. It's not, somebody's fantasy. It's not an Indiana Jones Raiders of the Lost Ark thing. The stuff is there. You could see it. You could see the proof. You could see the writings of these people. They were so excited, the SS group. They came back with copies of the Tibetan scriptures. They came back with flora and fauna, things that they had gathered. They made film footage. They took photographs of the people. They also measured cranial size. So they had calipers, and there's photographs of them doing this.
Was it
Bruno
phrenology
Baker,
or something like
yeah.
that? Something
Well,
pseudoscience?
yeah, it was a kind of a pseudoscience thing. We're trying to see if
Mhm.
the Tibetans and the Germans are related ethnically, if this is like the long lost German people, right? Living up
Mhm.
there in the wastes of the Himalayas, that they're protecting this ancient secret. This is the kind of stuff that they were financing, right? This is what they were doing. This was like, what? We sort of make fun these days of CIA and MK Ultra. These guys were taking MK Ultra to the next level, right? So they were trying
What
to
was
do
what
similar
was the
things.
OSS's mission? To figure out what they were up to, or to look at the same stuff?
Well, to figure out what the Nazis were up to, right? They wanted to know what the
Okay,
SS
yeah.
people were doing, number one. Number two, Tibet was in a very strange political situation because the relationship with China, the relationship with India, and with Pakistan, or what would become Pakistan. So they're in a kind of an area where India was being controlled by the British at this time until 1947.
Hmm.
So Tibet was kind of not exactly there. They were sort of in the sphere of influence, but not quite. It was a separate country. So when we had the famous explorer Heinrich Harrer, 7 years in Tibet, right? He was a German SS officer. He escaped from a British concentration camp when the war broke out, and he wound up crossing the border into Tibet, where he was safe. So the British and had this sort of hands-off or attitude towards Tibet. They were not really, they didn't have that great a degree of influence in Tibet over the Dalai Lama,
Hmm.
who was a young guy at this point. He was a teenager. So there was this maneuvering back and forth. And at the end of the war, when Heinrich Herrer is going to leave and the Dalai Lama is going to escape, the Chinese are coming in, and the OSS is now providing an escape route for the Dalai Lama to get out and get into India, cross Nepal and into northern India, and Dharamsala, where he eventually wound up. So you have the world's intelligence agencies, focused on Tibet to a certain extent, because it was realpolitik, right? You're fighting China
Hmm.
on one side, which is moving in. You have the Russians on another side. You have Nicholas Roerich and all of that stuff, and Red Shambhala, as they called it. So you had this whole thing happening, and you had Indian independence happening, and the
Hmm.
English were getting kicked out of India. So this was a very volatile area. So you can understand why the intelligence services were going to be there. But that's not why the SS expedition was there. They were there to find out, what was going on in Tibet. Can we get copies of the documents? Can we bring some monks over to train us in these mystical arts? And can we find proof that the Aryans fled after whatever ice age and wound up in the Himalayas? Do the Tibetans have some secret knowledge that we can, possess and use to our benefit in the war, the upcoming war at that time? So
Yeah,
one,
I think
yeah,
what's
one
interesting
side,
about Tibet is like
yeah,
I think the first CIA star, right? The star representing someone who died
mhm.
on a mission, I think was in Tibet,
I think you're right. Yeah,
which is
it's
which is
an,
odd. Anyway, sorry to interrupt. I just
well,
wanted to add that.
just one more note before I forget. The guy measuring the skulls with the calipers is a guy called Bruno Baker. He was, had a great old time in Tibet. Became a friend, stayed a friend of the Dalai Lama basically to the end of his life. Wrote
Hmm.
some articles for the Dalai Lama's blog and website or whatever over the years. Um, but when he got back to Germany, he set up his own museum of human development, I guess you might say. Evolution, not quite the same thing, but similar to that. And Beger went to the concentration camps and picked living subjects that he wanted their skeletons for his museum. So he was a war criminal, right?
Hmm.
He went there and said, I want this guy, this guy, this guy. Kill them, right? Deflesh them, but make sure you preserve the skeletal material because I need that in my museum. Okay, so this was a monstrous individual, and he was part of that SS expedition. Ernst Schaefer, who was the head of that expedition, fled. He wound up, I think, in Venezuela for a while, and he was in South America, which is a whole other story, uh, which we don't have time to go into. But here's, the Nazis in South America story, which is a whole other thing. So you have these guys spreading out as far as they could, trying to escape Nuremberg. Bruno Beger was denazified, right? They didn't put him in jail for very long. He was out pretty quickly, and he had a perfectly nice life to the end of his days in Germany and remained friendly with the Dalai Lama until somebody somewhere said, Mr. Dalai Lama, ixnay on the Egerbay. This guy was a Nazi. He committed war crimes. You really don't want his reminiscences about Tibet up on your website. So that was eventually taken down, right?
Mm-hmm.
But he was, there's story. I mean, you can look at the Tibet situation from different perspectives. The Dalai Lama was friendly with a lot of people who were Nazis, and even the former ambassador of Chile to India, a guy called Miguel Serrano, was a rabid Nazi during the war. His name is on the list of members of the Nazi Party during World War II in Chile. And he became an ambassador later. He was ambassador, I think, to Austria. He was an ambassador to India, and became very close friends with the Dalai Lama. Have photographs taken together, the whole thing. But he would write about Hitler as being a kind of messiah for the Aryan race. And he had all these very strange books, which I came across when I was in Chile. And I was shocked because Miguel Serrano was kind of a well-known author in New York circles because he had been a friend of Jung and of Hess. And he wrote some memoirs about that. Nobody knew his other side, which was that he was giving the Hitler salute at the funeral of Walter Rauff in Chile, the guy who invented the mobile gas fan, right? So, this is the kind of stuff that was going on. So when you try to extricate religion and politics, we live in a kind of dream world in the United States where these things are not supposed to mix, but man, do they mix, right? And it's better to be aware of this and to be aware of people's belief systems where this is concerned. And of course, people are a lot more open about it these days than they were before. You're seeing a lot more people talking about this more openly. But back when I was writing Sinister Forces and Unholy Alliance, people were trying to keep that as private material, not for general consumption, right? There were prayer breakfasts and things like that, but they were generic. Now we're learning more and more about actual religious beliefs and ideas about our political people and people in culture in general. And we have to be, I think, aware of it, aware of where this is coming from and where it could possibly lead as a belief system informing political action. This is what scares me.
Yeah, well, better it's out. Sunlight is typically the best disinfectant, right? The more
Sure.
that's out there, the better you can gauge on what's going on. So they had an expedition they being the SS, had an expedition to Tibet.
Yep.
And where did this lead? Where do they take it from there when they kind of return, or as World War II progresses? What happens next?
Well, they are given a hero's welcome when they come back. I mean, it made the front pages of all the German newspapers. I have clippings of that. I mean, it was like, and the headlines were very strange. The first white men in Lhasa is the most famous, headline, which was not really true, but anyway, that's how they promoted it. And it was like a big deal because this was like they were bringing proof and evidence that there was this Aryan super race that existed around the world. And that was part of Heinrich Himmler's thing. He was just fascinated by this. And Himmler being very involved in occultism. And then you had Rudolf Hess, who was Hitler's second in command at that time, very involved in occultism. He was born in Alexandria in Egypt, and he had become, I think, involved in Freemasonry to an extent. He got involved in all kinds of other occult practices. He believed that he was in telepathic communication with his wife during all the years he spent in Spandau prison after the end of the war. I mean, so here was a guy deeply embedded. And then there was the Haushoffers, Karl Haushofer and his son. Haushofer invented this idea of geopolitics. He was like the guy who was coming up with these concepts. He had been a frequent traveler to Japan, and he was instrumental in getting Nazi Germany to cooperate with Japan instead of cooperating with China. So he was a major fixture in that. And again, for occult kind of reasons. He was very fond of Zen Buddhism, the whole Bushido, the way of the warrior. and he was involved with another German mystic and philosopher who was also deeply involved with the Japanese and wrote a lot of books about Japanese Buddhism, but at the same time was an advisor to the Japanese government as to how to deal with the Chinese and how that the Chinese should, bear the brunt of the way of the Japanese warrior, right? So he was actively agitating for a slash and burn invasion of China. So we don't really know this. We can go to occult bookstores and we see these books and they're interesting, and we don't know the background of the authors unless we really do some deep digging, and then we go, holy, cow, what is this all about? I mean, even someone as seemingly beyond reproach, maybe as an Eric von Daniken, right? Mm-hmm. So here's Chariots of the Gods, and here's a guy, he's Swiss. Okay, that doesn't mean that he's, a Nazi, of course, he's Swiss. But the guy that was his partner that started him in on all of this and was helping him publish these books initially was a guy who was an editor for the ultimate Nazi newspaper during the war, right? So the newspaper that was run by the Nazi party, this guy was an editor of it. And he's the partner of Eric von Daniken putting out these books about, Chariots of the Gods. So you start hooking at all of this, and you can see why there's this pushback these days on the kind of ancient aliens, or did aliens build the pyramids, that kind of thing, because it's so intertwined with this racial theory that was very popular in the 20s and 30s, right? And especially through the Nazi era, that you're kind of hesitant to go there because you're going to stumble over all these weird guys who are claiming, right, these Egyptians were brown people. They could not have built the pyramids, right? It had to be white people, or if not white people, at least aliens. Come on. So you had this kind of situation going on. So Himmler was the magnet for all of this. I mean, if you were a crackpot and you had a really weird mystical theory about the universe, you would find a berth, at the Ahnenerbe, at his pet operation there. He had Otto Rahn working for him, and Otto Rahn was looking for the Holy Grail, in the south of France. So he wrote 3 books on the subject, and he was a member of the Ahnenerbe, the SS Ahnenerbe. He was an SS officer, this guy. And yet, he was being sent on these missions to look for the Grail and to write about, can you find the origins of where is the Grail? Where, who was protecting it? What groups were involved? So you learned about the Cathars from him, and the idea that the Cathars were an anti-church group, perfect for Himmler, because they're trying to get rid of Christianity. Christianity was the enemy of the German state. People will say, well, wasn't Hitler a Catholic? Hitler was a Catholic, and Himmler was a Catholic, and there's no anti-Christian like a lapsed Catholic. I can tell you that from my own personal experience. So these guys were looking to replace the power of the Catholic Church and of Christianity in general with a kind of new German paganism. At least Himmler was. Hitler maybe didn't care as much. That wasn't his main idea, except when he was in the trenches during World War I, Hitler did write poetry as odes to the Teutonic gods. He wrote poetry to Wotan, Hitler, in the trenches. So he had this pagan kind of thing. And before the war started, he was reading these magazines, the Ostara, and magazines being put out by these weird New Templar guys who were, the Templars were also a magnet for this belief, because here was an order of knights that was being persecuted by the church. Again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And so the Templars were like heroes to a lot of people in the pagan world and the anti-Christian and the anti-Catholic world. Even though they were Templars, they were supposedly knights of Christ. They weren't exactly. Maybe they worshiped Baphomet, and maybe they were pagans, maybe they were this, maybe they were that. So that got a lot of attention. So all of this gets mixed into the Third Reich. So now you have Nazi Germany, you have all these really strange individuals all working directly for Himmler, the most dreaded individual next to Hitler in all of Nazi Germany. The guy who ran the Gestapo, the guy who ran the SS, the guy who was in charge of the camps eventually. So here's a guy running the concentration camps with one hand, and he's researching Tibet with the other, and he's supporting German occult groups around the world. So there's film footage of German Beltane ceremonies, May Eve, Walpurgisnacht ceremonies in Argentina, So there are all these blonde Germans, with torches and a very familiar looking kind of parade taking place in Argentina celebrating, pagan holidays. So there was this money going in towards that. And the swastika then became this powerful symbol. Can you think of any political party whose symbol is that powerful, is that recognizable, that people see it and immediately they have a visceral reaction to it? It was supposed to be a political
No.
party.
The closest is the hammer and the sickle. That's the closest
you can come
that
to.
Doesn't come.
And nobody's using
doesn't
that
come close.
anymore. Yeah.
Right.
And it's,
right. Well,
and as I said in Unholy Alliance, the Nazi Party was not a political party the way we understand political parties. They didn't care about policy. They didn't care about making the trains run on time. The Nazi Party was a cult. It was a cult of personality, Hitler at the top of it, but it had all the trappings of a cult, the Nuremberg rallies, the torchlit processions, the swastika itself on everything, the death's head symbols, the ring, the SS ring, which was designed by another occultist, a guy called Willigut, or a Weistor, as he liked to be called. Here was a guy who had been an inmate of an insane asylum in Germany, who had been let out and had managed to convince Himmler that he had complete memory of all of Germany's. He'll tell you exactly what was happening at any year, at any era in Germany's history, what was really going on. He's the guy who designed the SS ring that all the SS officers were awarded at a certain stage, right? So this is the amount of influence they had. This is the amount of influence the occultists had within the German Reich. Now, you can look at the German army, you say, well, these guys maybe were not as indoctrinated, but the SS was. And the German army too, let's not kid ourselves, to a large extent also was. But the SS was definitely a cult. You had racial and genetic requirements for the SS. You had all sorts of things they had to do. They got rid of baptisms. They got rid of the marriage ceremonies. You can see copies of this at the captured German records. They had their own rituals for weddings, for baptisms and that sort of thing. They wiped out any reference to Christianity at all. And they went so far as to create a German Christian church in which Jesus was not Jewish, but he was the son of an Aryan, of a Roman centurion. And so they excised all the Jewish stuff out of the Bible, which meant the Bible.
Did they just make that up, or is there an obscure source from somewhere that made that claim? They just make it up that he wasn't Jewish?
They pretty much made it up. I mean,
okay.
there were stories running around towards the end of the 19th century that there was a Roman soldier that he might have been the actual father, but there's no evidence of that at all. I mean, it doesn't make sense. There's no data to support this at all. It was just somebody's idea that this maybe is what happened. That's how she got pregnant. She had to hide the pregnancy, because it was a non-Jew and blah, blah, blah. So they made up this elaborate story. But, Mary was already Jewish. So according to Jewish law, Jesus was Jewish regardless of who the father was. So anyway, all this stuff was going on and it was hysterical, right? But Hitler was not so quick to go against Christianity because he knew his people, right? He had photographs of himself being taken, and I have some of them, where he would leave a church and the photographer would set it up just right, that as Hitler was leaving the church with his head bowed, the crucifix on top of the entrance was positioned exactly over his head. So it looked as though God was blessing him on his way out. And that was used a lot to kind of promote Hitler's messiahship to those Germans who were still very much believing Christians. But then on the other side, you had Himmler, who wouldn't have any of it, right? So it was a very, very complicated situation between Hitler and Christianity. It was a love-hate relationship. And eventually, of course, he got a lot of cooperation from the Catholic Church because they both had a common enemy in communism. And again, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So they had this common enemy. So the church officially had a lot of problems with Hitler and with Nazism, but underneath it, they were fighting the same cause. They wanted the communists out of Germany. They wanted the communists out of Europe. And so that's why at the end of the war, you had the church actively involved in helping a lot of war criminals escape justice at Nuremberg with false identification papers. And as I found out while I was researching, I wrote 3 books on the Nazis. Unholy Alliance was the first. And then there was Ratline. Finally, when I got to Hitler Legacy, I found more documentation showing that some of the museums in Rome were acting as way stations for the Nazis to come out as well. The monasteries and even one museum was being used as kind of a safe house for the Nazis on the run, on their way out from Genoa on board ship to South America and other parts of the world. So there was a very active presence, and some very prominent Catholic clergymen, archbishops, cardinals were pro-Nazi, both before, during, and after the war. So you're dealing with this complex. We think of Germany, we think of World War II in terms of the battles, in terms of the armies, in terms of all of this. But underneath all of that, even in terms of the Holocaust, but underneath it was a very strange belief system, but very heavily articulated, based kind of on some theosophical ideas, because evolution, Darwinian evolution, was a body blow to religion in many ways, because it meant that the Adam and Eve thing had to be wrong. So they embraced theosophy that said, no, there is evolution, there's spiritual evolution, and races can be spiritually involved. And right now we're going through the stage where we have a spiritual, evolution of people, and there's this Aryan race, and they're really good guys. And Blavatsky did write in some snide ways about the Jewish people. And she eventually abandoned the study of Kabbalah and the kind of all the Western Christian mysticism, and completely embraced the Asian approach to it, which kind of got her out of that whole thing. So she didn't have to even think about it anymore, right? So yeah, it's a complex subject for sure.
Well, doesn't theosophy have some sort of direct link or indirect link to the development of remote viewing? Like, wasn't Russell Targ a theosophist and, ultimately helped create the protocol?
If you're going back to the SRI days and everything, you had theosophists, you had Scientologists, you had Rosicrucians, everybody, because these were all modalities for doing exactly that. When you start thinking of remote viewing as a possibility, where are you going to go for your data, right? There wasn't any data called remote viewing in the 19th century, but there was a lot of occultism in the 19th century, and a lot of mind control, scrying. Dee and Kelly, during the Elizabethan times with their magic mirrors. So you had all of this. This was already there. It was there. It was ready for anybody who wanted to look at it and take it seriously. So sure, these guys would look at it seriously. Hal Puthoff had been a Scientologist, a Thetan, at one point. Jacques Vallée at one point had been involved with the Rosicrucian Society. It hadn't been for decades, but for a while, because these guys were investigating it, like I investigated. I mean, they're investigating these systems. What do they mean? What can they produce? Why are they doing this? What are the implications of it? Can I train myself to do this without having to go through, initiation in some weird cult? Is this a technology that can be employed? Were they just technologists? Were these people engineers, spiritual engineers, you might say, or consciousness engineers? Was that what was happening?
Where did people like Orsic, I think Marina Orsic, is that the right name? How did they figure into all this?
Well, again, you're going back to the German cult groups. You're going back to this idea that there was Germany in between the wars was a hotbed of this stuff, right? So you had the Ascona group in Switzerland. Already in the 20s and 30s, you had Carl Jung, Gershom Scholem, Henry Corbin, Mircea Eliade, all these really famous names in psychology and anthropology and religion were having annual meetings in Switzerland, in Ascona, talking about all this stuff. And at the same time, you had other spiritual groups in that part of the Alps, who were also the guy who was involved with, Franz Hartmann was one guy who stands out, an occultist who was kind of flirting with the Nazi party as well, with Nazi ideas anyway. You had the Baron who wrote Before Hitler Came, the guy who was instrumental in creating the Thule Gesellschaft in Germany, the secret society that Hitler was investigating along with the German Workers' Party. So these guys were occultists. They were very heavily involved. So you had the OTO in Germany in the 1920s, which Crowley then would join and then later sort of take over. You had the Brotherhood of Saturn, the Fraternitas Saturni. This was a German group. I mean, the original Dracula film, Nosferatu, one of the producers on that film was a member of one of the German occult societies, right? So this was part of the milieu. This was part of the environment at the time. Occultism was very fashionable, and it was also attracting some of the best and the brightest, the artists, the writers, the musicians, and even the beginning of the film industry. All of these people were involved in this. So then you had, the books like Vril, the Power of the Coming Race, by Bulwer Lytton, who was British, but the Germans glommed onto this idea of Vril. And so there were rumors of a Vril society that was involved with occultism as well. I haven't really been able to find evidence of the Vril society, but again, we don't really need it. We have the Germanenorden, we have the Thule Gesellschaft, we have so many other, the Order of the Knights Templar, the ONT, the group that was run by, his name escapes me, but I'll come upon it. He was running this organization out of Vienna. Hitler would read his Ostara newsletter religiously, and it's a newsletter about occultism, but with heavy racial overtones. Mm-hmm. So Jews were always depicted like Charlie Manson, and the flower of German womanhood was always a tall blonde, being ravished by a Charlie Manson character, and that was the Jewish character in these editions. So Hitler's imbibing all of this in Vienna, before the war starts, before the war breaks out, World War I. So he's in deep in this, and his library had a lot of occult books in it after the war. Many were stolen, but some were still there. So he was still reading, making marginal notes in books of occultism in his own library at Berchtesgaden. So, it was there. It was in the air. It was part of what people did. So when you're trying to find out who knew who, man, everybody knew everybody. Dietrich Eckart was the guy that Hitler dedicated Mein Kampf to, right? So if you get a copy of Mein Kampf, the open dedication is to a man called Dietrich Eckart, who was a poet and a mystic, very heavily involved in occultism and mysticism, very much involved in grooming Hitler, trying to make Hitler into a vehicle. He died during the putsch, the 1923 attempt at the beer hall putsch. And so they had an elaborate sort of Nazi funeral for him. And then Hitler dedicated Mein Kampf to him and felt that strongly about Dietrich Eckart, another occultist, another mystic. So you can't extricate this. People try to say, well, the German occultism thing is overdone. We really don't have that much evidence, et cetera, et cetera. We have too much evidence. We're wallowing in it. It's just trying to make sense of it that's so difficult. What effect did this have on the people's actions? And I think that the primary evidence is the Holocaust being the most obvious evidence of occult ideas. But there's also Babelsberg Castle that Himmler created for himself as the kind of Vatican for his SS officers. I visited there for that television show he did, Faces of Evil, back around more than 20 years ago. And that's a very spooky place. I mean, the swastikas are embedded in the ceiling, embedded in the floor. There's 12 niches in the basement where the ashes of the dead SS generals will be kept. Seances will be held there. Himmler thought he was the reincarnation of a famous Teutonic king. All this stuff was going on all the time. Himmler believed that he was in contact somehow metaphysically with the ancient German rulers. I mean, so this is the guy running the camps. This is the guy running security for the Reich. This is the guy running the secret police. And he's deeply involved in occultism, in occult ideas, reincarnation, mental telepathy, memories of past lives, the Knights of the Round Table, the search for the Holy Grail, the Tibet expedition. I mean, it goes on and on. It all goes back to Himmler, and Himmler was the guy running interference for Hitler all over Germany, right? This was the guy making sure that the Third Reich stayed the Third Reich. You had an enemy, Himmler would see to this guy was erased, right? Whether it was a person or a group or an entire race of people, entire ethnicity. He had a museum called the Freemason Museum. It was like an exhibit of Freemasonry because that was the enemy too. And if you were a third degree Freemason, you went to the camps. That's was automatic.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Oh, you were a true believer. Yeah. That's an unholy alliance. The third degree Freemason to the camps. The first job that Adolf Eichmann ever had in the SS was as the curator of that Freemasonry museum. So you could just see, the extent to which this had a hold over the people running the country. It was incredible.
Do you think there's something non-physical that was influencing these leaders by dabbling in the occult, similar to sinister forces, just something that we can't quite place our hands on, but something that was kind of guiding and steering the German zeitgeist into this sort of direction?
Well, just take the sinister forces modality and switch it over to Germany or to Europe in general. We like to think of our history as neat little packages, and there's like demarcation points. This ended, this started, this ended, this started. And we do it with the timelines. We think the timeline is, okay, we're no longer pagans, right? At some point, Europe became non-pagan and became Christian, right? And we sort of make that heavy black line separating the two. That's nonsense. It's just, that removes context from so much that we're studying in history. There is a context that goes deep. For a lot of people living on this planet, 1,000 years is not that long ago, right?
Right.
I mean, the Hatfields and the McCoys are still hating each other after only a couple of hundred years, right? You've got issues that people are still fighting over in the Middle East. We're still fighting over things that happened 5,000 years ago. So to assume that because we are modern humans living in a modern quote unquote society, that we no longer have these issues is you're whistling in the dark. There's a lot that's still happening. There's a lot that the belief systems are still affecting us. They affect us every time we walk outside. You walk through, I've been through a lot of countries in Europe, and I used to be in business in Europe and in the rest of the world. So you can go, from Portugal to Spain to France to Germany, you're walking through history. It's not gone. You're walking through history itself. You're looking at castles that were built hundreds, if not 1,000 years earlier. You're walking through towns that have existed for over 1,000 years. And you're trying to tell yourself, well, they have Netflix, so that, that ancient history is gone. No, they're living it. They're breathing it. They're touching the stones where their ancestors lived and were born and died, and maybe were murdered by some church or some government, maybe burned as witches, for instance. You're going to be walking through areas where this past is still very much alive. No one's given it up. They have not just said, oh, we're moderns now, we don't believe in any of this stuff, because they're still fighting religious wars. They're still fighting the wars of Protestants versus Christians, and look at the pogroms against the Jews that took place right up until the 20th century. What is that all about? 2,000 years, really? You couldn't get over it? It's a long time to hold a grudge. You know what I'm saying? So there's this idea that we left it all behind. We didn't. We're living in it every single day. We have to be aware of it. So when you're asking, is there something non-physical, is there a spiritual force? It's there. It's there in the stones and in the earth. People still visit Stonehenge, and they don't have any clue when that was really built or why it was built. There's ideas constantly. Look at the pyramids. The pyramids are such an icon that, the Taliban swore that if they ever got to Egypt, they would blow them up, right? It's still like a problem. Like they blew up the Buddha statues in Afghanistan. This is still a problem for a lot of people. We have not gone past any of this. We're still trying to deal with it. And we're not doing a very good job of it either, because we're trying to hold our ears and say, blah, 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 nothing's going on. But it's all around us. We have to open our eyes and see what is really going on, what these people really believe, why they believe this. We have to understand how our psyches work, why they're holding on to all of this. And they're holding on to it because we are paranoid. We think that we don't know what's going on. And if we're reading our newspapers, if we still read newspapers, if we're looking at, at news programs, and we're traveling through the internet, and all of this other stuff, and we realize we still don't know what's going on, our natural tendency is to look towards the people who claim they knew what was really going on, right? Whether they did or not. So we're going to start looking at occultism. We're going to start looking at these mystical things. We're going to try to develop our own senses to try to, maybe we need a different sense. Maybe the 5 senses that we have are not enough. We need a 6th or a 7th or an 8th to see what's really going on. And yeah, kind of, you're right.
Yeah.
If you try to make an intellectual history of the human race, you're going to fail miserably. There's just too much data or too little data where you need it the most. So you're going to have to step back and think of a different way, a different approach to this. Like we have a different approach to the UFO phenomenon. We can't just use our basic,
Nuts and
ways of
bolts,
looking at
right?
this. It's something else we got to do. We got to figure that out. If we can figure that out, maybe we can figure the rest of it out. Sorry to bring up UFOs in this context, but
No,
it's
no,
just,
no. That is
it's
fair game. Right.
it's part of this. It's part of the story because that goes back thousands of years as well. There's a context for the UFO that goes back thousands of years. And we keep saying we're moderns. We don't believe in that anymore. We don't believe in that anymore. We keep saying that. We're whistling in the dark when we do that. Carl Sagan had this book, A Candle in the Dark, and I've always called it whistling in the dark, because it's really, you're trying to avoid something that's right there. It's the 800-pound, gorilla in the room, and it's our psyches, it's our consciousness, it's these abilities that all the occultists claim that they have, or claim that they can tap into, or claim that they can teach you, that may be the next step in our spiritual evolution that we need to take, some kind of technology. Because my interest in this is not ideological. I'm not an ideological person. I'm not trying to promote one religion over another or one spiritual practice over another. To me, spirituality is a kind of technology. And in that, I'm not too different from a Russell Targ or a Hal Puthoff or any of these guys. For me, it's a technology. There's something there, but I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. It's
Right.
Ritual has something to do with it. Mysticism of various kinds, shamanism, all of this, it all needs to be investigated with an open mind. And we need to
Right.
get past this idea that we're treating it like it's a literary genre. This is the thing that really bothers me a great deal, is we have a lot of academics now studying these texts, studying occultism, but they're treating it like a literary phenomenon. They're treating it like we're going to compare this text to that text or this writer to that writer. I'm thinking, what about the practice? Oh, no, we can't do that. We wouldn't be objective anymore. That's a subjective experience.
Yeah, I think they're just trying to do it with a fig leaf of academic
Yeah.
respectability. I think that's the way to look at it. For folks just joining, you're listening to Through a Glass Darkly radio with Sean Patrick Hazlett on United Public Radio, and I'm here with Peter Levenda. One thing I want to just add, because you probably may not have heard this, and then we can continue on. In terms of how this impacted the German zeitgeist, I recently interviewed somebody named, a psychoanalyst. His name's Jerry Marzinski. He spent about 40 years in various in prisons, various mental institutions, and he focused on schizophrenics. And for folks that don't know what that is, it's just people who have clinically have hallucinations, hear voices, etc. But what he did is at great personal risk to his own career. He had to be very quiet. It was easier in prisons, unfortunately, because for him to do. But he would start to talk to these patients and see what these voices were telling them. And I think he found 23 different patterns. But one thing that he mentioned in this interview that's relevant to this one is people who are meth addicts also start to develop some of these symptoms. They hear these voices when they use meth. And if they keep using meth and stop using meth, but they've used it long enough, they'll start hearing these voices permanently. And the reason I think that's relevant is that the entire German blitzkrieg was fueled by a drug that was marketed as Pervitin. It was a version of methamphetamine. The Germans called it Panzer Schokolade, tank chocolate. And one often wonders, and even Hitler himself was amped up on codeine and methamphetamine and things like that. A lot of these delusions, or whatever, you could argue it's all mental, but you could also argue that there's something from without that influences and may have influenced this invasion. So just to add context to that whole thing. So the next question I had for you is, when we brought over the paperclip scientists, did we import some of this stuff? Did we import some of this, these philosophies? In other words, if you kind of view it as an infection, did we infect ourselves with some of this stuff back in the 40s?
That's been my point all along. We should never have brought the scientists over under paperclip, or if we did, for whatever reason, they should never have been allowed to roam free like they did once they got here. These were people who were Nazis. I mean, they were believers, true believers for the most part. They were denazified in a sense, but for purely political reasons. This was not real denazification. This was like, okay, you're fine, go, So we, for instance, Strughold, Hubertus Strughold. Here was the guy who was the father of aviation medicine, right? But he was the father of aviation medicine by abusing his children, in a sense, because he operated in the camps. He took prisoners out of the camps and subjected them to horrible experimentation. I mean, he was a war criminal by any stretch of the imagination. And yet we brought him over.
Is this the guy whose experiments were talked about in Rise and Fall of the Third Reich by Scherer, where they talked about Russian prisoners and Jewish prisoners that were thrown in cold water to see how long they was?
Same guy. Yeah.
Okay.
He was the guy in charge.
I just wanted that context.
Absolutely. He was the guy in charge of that. So we bring him over and we put him in charge of our Aviation Medicine Institute at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas. We went so far as to name the institute after him after he died, until I think it was the Daughters of the American Revolution or one of those groups raised holy hell and said, you can't do that. This guy was a war criminal. So they had to take the name off the building. But here was a guy, he walked the halls, he was the father of aviation medicine. And he was a complete believing Nazi and a murderer, right? So we had so many of these people brought over, and it was, Albert Einstein fought against it. He wrote letters saying, don't do this. Eleanor Roosevelt did the same thing. This is wrong. You can't do this. This is hideous. But we did anyway. We wrote over 1,000 people under that program. We thought it was only a couple of hundred at first, but the documents eventually came out. It was more than 1,000 people were brought over, scientists, not even counting family members, but the scientists themselves were brought over. But the Soviets were doing the same thing. So the Soviets had many more thousands that they brought over, entire families. They built a town for them in Russia where they were kept apart from everybody else and were forced to work on rocket programs, propulsion, aviation things. So they had their own bunch, and we had a bunch over here working eventually in what will become our space program. But eventually it was the space program. Initially, it was the rocket program. It was not, it was for building missiles. And these scientists that we brought over were not our friends. They looked down on us. They thought we were ridiculous. Okay. They would sabotage the programs they were working on. At one point, one missile they fired off wound up in Mexico. It hit a town in Mexico. I think it was outside of Jalisco, if I'm not mistaken. People died, right? And that was the famous German technology that sent that rocket into Mexico. All kinds of things were happening. We found out later that these same German scientists at that base where that missile was fired were in correspondence with their counterparts in Europe and in Russia. They were sending letters back. They would go for a walk in town and they would drop off letters, and these letters would go back. So the Nazis scientists were communicating with each other, unbeknownst to the US government at the time. We couldn't trust these people, and then we have Werner von Braun, who was an SS officer, a high-ranking SS officer. This was somebody who was really SS. We like to paint.
He drank the Kool-Aid. He drank the Kool-Aid.
He wasn't one of these guys, I just want to be a scientist, so I'll put on the uniform, but I'm not really serious, like they all said. No, that was not. He was using slave labor at Peenemünde, right? So, come on. He knew what was going on, and he was, willingly part of it. And then he tried to say that he really wasn't a Nazi when he came over, because they wanted him. They needed Werner von Braun. They needed, besides Strughold, the what's his name? The other general, the one Werner von Braun worked for this guy at Peenemünde, and his name again escapes me. But we brought him over. We sent him to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So he's at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in July of 1947 when they bring the Roswell wreckage over, right? What is that guy doing there, And he was there for a while, and then he gets on the board of Bell Aerospace. So now he's a directorship in Bell Aerospace, and that gets us into a whole bunch of Sinister Forces stuff, which is beyond the scope of this program. But so there's him, whose name escapes me. There's General Kammler, right? The famous, mysterious, disappearing general, The guy
Yeah.
who was in charge of rebuilding the Peenemünde installation in Austria under a mountain, and did it in record time. They're still finding tunnels of that operation that he built, and it's incredible. They were building Messerschmitts underneath a mountain in a tunnel. They had tremendous facilities there. It was like something out of a James Bond film. And then the war is over. The Allies are coming in from both sides. Kammler then sends Werner von Braun and a bunch of the other scientists to wait for him at a cafe, knowing the Americans will show up and take them to the States. Kammler himself disappears. No one's heard from him since 1945, right? An important, very important general, a guy who was an organizational genius, not a scientist, more of an engineer and a technocrat, sort of, but an organizational genius. He knew where everything was. He knew where all the rights...
Kind of like an Albert Speer sort of character. Yeah.
Kind of like that. With hands-on building these facilities, right? Managed to do all of that and then disappear. And I think it was Nick Cook who wrote the book, The Hunt for Zero Point, right? The zero point energy. And Kammler, of course, shows up in there. Did he wind up in Czechoslovakia? Was he in Prague? Because one of his organizations was in Prague. And it turns out, we find out with a handful of documents just recently, we had Kammler all this time. The United States had Kammler. They picked him up and they buried him deep so that nobody knew they had him. And that has come out in a book that came out just like a year or two ago.
What did they do with him? Did it say, or did we just picked him up and made him disappear?
They picked him up. I guess they used him for whatever intel that he had, but they didn't want anybody else to know they had Kammler, because Kammler was really, in a sense, more important than Werner von Braun or any of the others, because he knew the whole layout. He knew where everything was, where all the assets were located, the technology. He knew where the blueprints were, where the scientists, the engineers. He knew where the parts were buried. He knew all of that. That was his thing. He was a hands-on organization man, and that's why he was put in charge of that. So, he was put in charge of the whole Peenemünde program. He was put in charge of the whole super weapons, secret weapons program. So stuff that Werner von Braun would not have known, or Struckhold would not have known, or any of these guys would not have known, he knew. So I think that was the reason why they took him and they buried him, and no one's ever heard from him since. They had him in their hands, and for some reason, we're not allowed to know why. But it is interesting that,
Why do you think he was so strategic? Other than knowing everything, did he know anything about particular technology? You mentioned the hunt for zero point.
He would have known.
Him super strategic.
That would have made him super strategic for sure. Alternate energy, alternate propulsion systems, which lead us back to our good friends, the UFO phenomenon. So
let's go with that thread. That's exactly where I wanted to tug on the thread now. So what about the interaction, or I shouldn't say interaction, but how were they related to this Third Reich occult, as well as some of these scientists, Kammler, all that?
Well, the Reich was heavily invested in trying to find some sort of aircraft with a super propulsion system that wouldn't need the wings and the propellers and all the rest of it. So you had the Horten brothers. Everyone's heard of the Horten brothers, right? And their flying wing design is almost identical to what Kenneth Arnold saw over the Pacific Northwest in 1947. I mean, he saw a flight of these things, and he drew a picture of them. They were not saucers. He used the term saucer, but when he actually drew pictures of them, they were the Horten flying wings, right? But these things were flying like crazy. He couldn't keep up with them. So were these the Hortens, or was this one of these UFO tricks, like the floating ships of the 1898 period, where you had ships sort of floating in the air?
Airships.
Is this like a UFO, the airship thing? Was this like a UFO trick? Did they make it look like the Horten wings? Was this like a cloaking device just to screw with us? Or was there a Nazi technology base somewhere on the planet, and they were flying these things, right? They were testing them in over U.S. airspace. Maybe the idea was to fly them over Canada, because they were very close to the border. And Canada, especially in 1947, there were a handful of cities, and the rest of the country was, ice and snow, right? It was very remote. Maybe there was a base, someplace, maybe closer to Alaska. Who knows where these things were coming from?
What about Neue Schwabenland, which was in the Antarctic, the German land there? Was there any potential escape there or usage of that area there, or is that just
Yeah, as
they
I
kind of shut
mentioned,
that down?
I think it was in the Hitler Legacy, or maybe Ratline, I forget now. It's all one big book to me. I talk about the fact that Hitler's the famous submarine commander that Hitler had, who ran the submarine fleet,
What's it,
made a
Dunitz?
speech. Von Dönitz. He made a
Hmm.
speech to an incoming cadet class, saying, "If anything goes wrong, we're going to save the Fuhrer. We have a place for him that we're going to hide him out in, right? We're going to use submarines, and this guy's going to escape." And he was making allusions to Antarctica.
Hmm.
Um, the Antarctic expedition is one of those things that made no sense at the time. Here's Nazi
Byrd, right?
Germany. Yeah.
Admiral Byrd's
Well,
expedition. Yeah.
both of them.
Okay.
The first one was the German expedition in 38, right? Made
Okay.
no point. There was no point to that unless they were planning on building military bases there, right?
Hmm.
The Germans were, thinking far-reaching, but that was still beyond their capabilities at the time. They were fighting a war against Russia, or they were about to. So that would take all of their resources. So having a base in Antarctica didn't make any sense. So they were thinking of that, and they sent an expedition. Now they dropped Nazi flags, little swastika flags all over Antarctica, saying this was their territory, and they went back.
Right.
So they printed up flyers about this. There was all kinds of stuff, Neue Schwabenland and all of that. And then we, at the end of World War II, we're broke. Our Navy is broke. Our government is broke. We fought an exhausting war. They're cutting back on everything. They're cutting back on all of our military resources in 46, 47, 48, right? We're cutting all this back. And then we decide we're going to conduct this extremely expensive expedition to Antarctica. Don't know why. Weird. It just felt like it, Right. We're going to send Admiral Byrd down there because he's the cover guy, Byrd is taking this thing and it's like heroic. We're going to go down there. All these ships, all these personnel. No one is trained in the equipment. They don't have the right equipment. They're just going to go down there. An entire convoy is going to go down there. They're going to rummage around there. They're going to come back. They're going to lose people. People are going to die down there. Equipment's going to fail. There's going to be a handful of photographs and video stuff, but not much. They're going to come back and say, "Oh yeah, it was a great success, right? Everything is fine. Don't worry about it." At an enormous expense to the taxpayer, we did this. Yeah. And to this day, we can't get a straight answer as to why the hell we went down there in the first place. But if you have a Sinister Forces kind of mentality and you're looking for threads to pull, there's one thread that really doesn't make any sense. Beyond the Admiral Byrd thing and the statement that, planes are going to fly from pole to pole instead of around the world this way, they're going to
go this. It's a weird statement. Right.
A weird statement that he made. Instead of all that, okay, there was a guy on board ship in that expedition who was, as it turned out, a Nazi. Not just like a neo-Nazi, like an American kind of neo-Nazi kind of guy. No, this guy was a Nazi before the war. He was a member of the Nazi Party. He was also a member, I think, of the SD, basically the secret police, if I'm not mistaken. That was his famous claim to fame. And yet the war breaks out. We enter the war at the end of 1941. And this guy gets involved. He's part of the U.S. Navy now. Now he's in the military, our military. Although the guy is a Nazi, he's in our military, and he's on that expedition to Antarctica.
What was his rank? Like, where did they bring him on as an officer?
He was an officer, I believe. He also had a wealthy background. He had some sort of patronage behind him as well. So I think he was a lieutenant, if I'm not mistaken. I can go and look back. I have the documents, or you can find it in one of the books. And so he comes back. Okay, that's not the end of it. If that was the end of the story, okay. But then it turns out that he's running basically Odessa in the United States. So he's running like a program to hide Nazis and to make contact with Nazi groups in South America, Europe, and elsewhere. He's in the nexus. He's in the middle of it. He's approving people to be involved with this Nazi underground. If he doesn't like you, you're not going to be in it. So he's still working for Germany. Okay, that's bad enough. So here's a dedicated Nazi. Somehow he's on our side during the war, and then he's on that Antarctica expedition. Then he runs like an American neo-Nazi underground, or not a neo-Nazi, Nazi underground. But there's one more wrinkle. Lee Harvey Oswald. Okay.
Mm-hmm. This goes back to Lee Harvey Oswald and Kennedy.
Everything goes back to Lee Harvey. Lee Harvey Oswald, at one point, was trying to go to school in Switzerland. And I have the records of that. He had applied and been accepted to this weird little school in Switzerland. Never made it, right? He goes to Europe because he's supposed to go to the school, but that's when he goes to Finland and then to Russia and defects. But he was set up to go to school, to college, in this university, in this small, I think it was called the, if I'm not mistaken, the Albert Schweitzer Institute in Switzerland. It's a very small little operation. The Unitarians were involved. The Unitarian Universalist Church was somehow involved with them as well. Okay, fine. He comes back, the whole thing with he defects back to the United States. We all know that story. Eventually, the assassination happens. He's dead. They have his address book. And in his address book, there's the address for the American Nazi Party, right? He's got the name, phone number, address of the headquarters in Queens, New York, of the Nazi Party. Okay, that's a little weird. And he has all these German words and phrases he's been writing down. Okay, also weird. He's dead. His mother, Marguerite, is like all in the news. She's being interviewed by people. Your son killed the president. Who is her literary executor? The same guy who was on that ship in Antarctica, who was a Nazi working for the Reich as an intelligence officer, and then running a Nazi underground operation in the United States. He turns up out of the clear blue sky representing officially Marguerite Oswald in all her dealings with the press and all her public appearances and all the rest of it. This is the guy who runs that for her. We don't know how that happened. I've gone through his records. I've gone through all kinds of stuff. But now we're back to Lee Harvey Oswald. You see, at this point, this is where everybody shuts off. Everybody says, okay, no, forget it. I'm out. This is it. It doesn't make sense anymore. We cannot tie this together. There's no way to tie these strings together. We cannot figure this out. Nazis and Antarctica and Lee Harvey Oswald assassinations, UFOs, we haven't even gotten there yet. All of this stuff in one big package. And this is the problem we have. This is the problem that I faced when I was starting with Sinister Forces, and I started writing it during Watergate, right? So this is when I'm starting to put this together. And then I realized, oh God, this is not making any sense anymore.
If I had to spitball it, again, this is very simplistic in terms of theory, but I can see how our intelligence agencies would leverage this German network in the post-war in order to position people, gather intelligence vis-a-vis the Russians. But even then, and then that kind of leads into the Lee Harvey Oswald thing. Maybe this guy, and the other weird part is, why is he this pathfinder to Antarctica? That's what it doesn't make. Was he on the first expedition?
No, he was on the second, the U.S. expedition.
Oh, so that was his first. So yeah, it's almost like he knew something, but it's just weird. Very strange.
You wonder if he pulled strings to be able to get on that expedition because he suspected they were going to find something, because he had been involved with the Nazis before, right? He would have known, as everybody did, about the Neuschwabenland expedition. He would have known about that. Maybe he wanted to be on that expedition. He wanted to see what they find before they found it, right? So that he would be able to warn people. It's possible that he had his own function in mind when he went on that expedition. Maybe he pulled strings to get on it. We just don't know, because it's the record is very bland. You try to get records out of that expedition, the U.S. expedition. It's devilishly hard. They have some boilerplate stuff they release, but it doesn't go into any of the details.
Yeah, I kind of wonder. I mean, you're familiar with this apocryphal story about Byrd flying over the South Pole and seeing the special master. It sounds to me like it's just a kind of an old wives' tale or a hoax kind of story.
Yeah,
did you find any?
I can't find verification of it. I think it was the North Pole. He flew over and he saw like jungles or something, and he saw like a hole in the earth. Hollow Earth story. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't found verification of that story. That's a problem, right? If I found verification of it, if Byrd was having those hallucinations, or if he actually saw something like that, that would be fascinating. But that's the Germans, the Nazis at the time, were also very interested in the Hollow Earth story as well. They were interested in that, and they were interested in the world ice theory, which was another crackpot idea. Yeah. Well, the world ice theory, you have the planet Earth, and it's surrounded by a kind of ice crystal mirror that if you bounced a radar signal off of it on one part of the Earth, you could triangulate it and find out the location of an enemy submarine on the other side of the world, right? Because the signal would bounce off and as if it was a plate glass of some kind or a metal shield. So this would go bouncing, and so they kind of thought that might be possible. And there was a German concept, a German philosopher, crank scientist came up with it. And one of the reasons why they say there was the Tibet expedition, one of their reasons was to see if they could somehow send a signal from Tibet, and find the location of a ship someplace else on the planet, that they were given the coordinates by the German Navy, so they could find the Kriegsmarine, so they could find out where that ship was. There was like one of the experiments they were supposed to conduct. We don't know what happened to that experiment, but that's one of the things they were supposed to go looking for. So there was the world ice theory and the hollow earth theory. So there was an earth underneath an earth, or there was something outside of the earth that was bouncing radio signals off of, that you could use it, strategically or tactically in a military conflict. So you had that too. Don't know, man.
So how were the UFOs involved? In terms of the Germans, how were they influenced by them? You hear about this magenta. You don't hear about. Grush testified before Congress that there was a crash recovery in Magenta, Italy, in 1933. So how does that fit into all this stuff?
Well, it fits. It's perfectly 33, right? It's a very suggestive year for all this to be happening. That's the year that Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. So maybe there was this idea, let's get this thing out of his reach, out of the reach of fascist Mussolini and out of the reach of, the Nazi Germany, and get it out of there so that we can take a look at it. So yeah, that record exists. Something like that took place, we know. And we also know even more to the point, and you're going to read about it in the third volume of Secret Machines.
When's that coming out again? I know somebody's going to ask. So
I think it's coming out in September. I think we're still on schedule for September. So I don't know the date yet, but sometime later this year. And there is a story in there about the Soviets who captured the German scientists were forcing the German scientists to work on a UFO prototype. So there was this real race between the Germans and the Russians and the United States to develop some kind of UFO technology. Like they believed it existed. And if Magenta was the reason, that could be the reason why they were devoting so many resources, that they were trying to duplicate whatever that technology was, because they had a lot of Soviets working on it. And you had one German scientist who came over with paperclip, who was telling anybody who wanted to listen that there were UFOs, and he was another high-ranking officer. Again, that's in Secret Machines as well. And he gave interviews to newspapers saying, yeah, man, there's UFOs. There was a lot of explicit, not implicit, but explicit acknowledgement of the existence of this technology back right after the war was over. They were running around telling everybody about this, but it got lost in the shuffle. It got lost in the Iron Curtain situation. It got lost in the Korean War. It got lost eventually in all the other wars we've been involved with since then, and all the other conflicts. So all of that got buried and buried and buried. But ask yourself one question. Let's just a logic experiment. The Chinese are doing this experimentation. The Russians are doing it. The Americans, as we know, are doing it. We have all of these countries involved with the UFO phenomenon one way or the other. And yet nobody has come out definitively and said, we have this in our possession. No one's come out and said anything officially in any of these governments, and they've changed governments so many times. We went from the Soviet Union to the fall of the Soviet Union to modern day Russia. They're still not talking about it. China, still not talking about it. The United States, through all the things we've been through in the last 70 odd years I've been alive, nothing. We don't talk about it, right? We're starting to now in Congress. It's starting to break open a little bit, but nobody wants to talk about it. What would the reason be for all of these countries to keep quiet on this subject, regardless of their political situation, regardless of who's in charge? Why is everybody keeping quiet about it? What would be the one thing that would scare the hell out of any government? My feeling is it's the idea that there is another government, right? There is a force on the planet which is stronger, more capable, more of a threat, and it's a threat to everybody, right? Now, people hate when I talk about this because, oh, you're
No, I
promoting.
think you're onto something. When people say these things are ETs, I think there's either it's some sort of phenomenon that we don't understand. Could be living, could be plasma being, who knows, right?
Right.
It could be some other non-human intelligence that has a civilization that, look, if you look at the six major die-offs that we've had throughout history,
Mhm.
burrowing species are the ones that always survive.
Right.
So if you imagine a highly intelligent species like us that burrows, and is that, insects kind of do that.
Right.
It could explain the common gray and mantis experiences that people have. I don't know. I'm spitballing. But anyway, continue on your this fourth kind of, or this
Right.
I guess
It has,
breakaway civilization is the parlance people use sometimes.
yeah, it's whether it's humans, which I doubt. Actually, I don't really subscribe to the deep state concept. I know it's attractive for a lot of people, and I know that it can answer some things, but it doesn't answer
Mm-hmm.
everything. So I think it's not that. I think it is something quote unquote alien to us, but it's the the ability that it has is a threat to every government because no
Mm-hmm.
government can defend against it. It's
Right.
just that bluntly. So why would they come out and talk about it unless they could come out with a solution? Nobody has a solution to this problem yet. So I think it's there. I think that's the threat, that it's there. I'm not trying to promote more money for the Defense Department because I think that's not the way to go. I think that the Defense Department has reached the end of its capabilities in defending us
Right.
against these things, as the Nimitz has demonstrated and all these other sightings have demonstrated. It doesn't matter how much money we pour into the Pentagon, it can't do anything about these things. So there has to be another approach we can take. And I think the other governments around the world are coming to the same conclusion, that we have to find another rationale, another way of looking at this, another modality of approach on this. This is a technology that probably has tentacles. I don't want to sound Lovecraftian about it, but it has tentacles like in other sciences, other practices, other ideas, other cultural artifacts that we don't understand yet because we think of things in terms of boxes. We put things in little compartments. This thing doesn't exist like that. Whatever environment it has, it's interconnected everything. It's connected mind and space and matter in a way that is devastating to us because we can't get our arms around it at all. And they seem to have done this. And you're right. They may be burrowing under the. It may be a burrowing under the earth thing. It may be like three-body problem.
Mm-hmm.
Bugs. It's just bugs, right? No matter what we do, we can't wipe out the bugs. The bugs will be there with us forever. So maybe the alien and three-body problem saying you're all bugs was not an observation. It was a
It's a
recommendation,
projection.
right?
Right.
It was
Oh yeah.
telling us,
Oh yeah.
you know, you're all bugs. Act like it, right? Start digging holes. I mean, it could be anything. Could be something that similar. So I know we've covered a lot of stuff in far-ranging areas here, but
Oh,
you
that's
say
great. I think.
through a glass darkly, man. That's what we're doing.
Yeah. No. I think the way to look at this is to be open-minded and see where these things correlate. Especially, I think, with the military's experience. At least, if you take all the stories that are out there and believe some subset of them are true, but whatever this phenomena is or phenomenon, it has the ability to influence perception, human perception.
Right.
So it might not be doing anything. It could be. I'm making this up. It could be a flower that somehow warps your perception of what it is,
Mm-hmm.
or what you're seeing, and gets you to do things. And I think it also somehow subtly interacts with humans over a vast time scale, right? Where it's almost like this directed evolutionary relationship, and almost symbiotic, parasitic sort of interaction. And the question is this going to be something that is multiple versions of this thing, different species, different phenomena, or is this all one thing that
Mm-hmm.
effectively controls the planet and we're just kind of its
Well,
playthings, so to speak?
I wrote it in Secret Machines, one of the first. I forget it was volume 1 or 2. towards the end, I said, we are in a symbiotic relationship with this phenomenon. They need us somehow
Mm-hmm.
because they're not screwing with us. I mean, they're screwing with us, but they're not doing anything too dramatic towards us. They may need us, and God help us, maybe we need them as well. Maybe this is a symbiotic relationship. We don't understand the contours of it yet, but it is something that's a mutual, right? So the governments are afraid because they
Mm-hmm.
can't control this. They don't understand it. And you have the religious people in our government who are 100% sure that these are
They're
demonic
demons.
forces,
Right.
right?
Right.
And I just wish they would come out and tell me exactly. Please tell me, define demon for me, please, because I'd like to know what you mean when you say that. We never define our terms in this field at all. It's just people say all kinds of things, but they do believe that it's evil forces, evil spirits, demons, whatever you want to call it. And there's a school of thought in the occult technologies that the
Mm-hmm.
demon, it's not really what we think it is, right? These are forces, these are powers, these are they we project onto this spiritual force all sorts of negative concepts, like we're doing now with the UFO. And some
Mm-hmm.
people project positive things onto the UFO, right? They're
Right.
angelic forces. You have that whole school of thought.
Someone's demon is another's angel.
Yeah. And that's where we're at. We don't know our own gods well enough to be able to say, is that a god, is that an angel, or a demon? Because we've shut ourselves off to that. We're closed to that. As I said before, we think we're modern people living in a
Mm-hmm.
modern age. We put all that aside, and every time a UFO shows up, it's laughing at us from that point of view. It's saying, yeah, right, you put it all aside. We've been here for thousands of years. You've been recording us for thousands of years, and you still don't know what we are. But you've put it all aside. You're modern people now. Right. Sure. Not exactly. Right. So we have to get our understanding together that we need to really focus on this, as I've been saying now for more than a decade. We need everybody, all hands on deck, to understand what this is. We can't just rely on the scientists and the military people and the intelligence people, and sure as hell not the politicians, to figure out what this is. We need everybody involved. We need the musicians and the writers. We need the painters. We need the psychologists, the soft sciences, everybody involved in trying to figure. Everybody has an angle on this. Everybody has a piece of the puzzle. We just don't realize it yet. But if we all got together in a room somewhere, we could probably get closer than we have
I
been in
think
the
so.
last 70 years. I think
Yeah,
it's
I think
there.
the problem. I think the advantage that the government has is they know which of these stories that are out there are fake,
Right.
disinformation, etc., because they've had the resources to focus on it.
Yeah.
And then they know ones that they can't know with certainty, but they probably know enough with a high degree of statistical significance that certain cases that have happened are real.
Mm-hmm.
And just to be able to interact with that database and just see like are the sightings over certain places, right, where there's lots of quartz or granite, is it geomagnetic,
Right.
is it does it happen during certain times, over nuclear facilities, right?
Mm-hmm.
Again, this would be classified, but I'd be fascinated to learn how often these things appear near nuclear submarines. I would imagine if I just had to extrapolate, it would be significantly more than a traditional ship or not just nuclear submarine, but regular diesel
Sure.
submarines. So I think this is, in terms of how this comes out, how, if this is the government's dilemma, how can the government, like, feasibly, I'm not kind of, if you're in the government right now and you're trying to solve for this problem where you want more brain power to be focused on this issue, how do you let enough of the population know that kind of what we know, while acknowledging that, like, look, we are completely powerless to whatever these things are, without freaking out other elements of the population that because I think it can be done. It just depends on what you know and what the nature of these things are. I mean, everything depends on that in terms of the
Sure.
strategy that you might use.
Yeah. And I think we don't know the best approach to take. And because we don't know that, we're not taking any approach. And that's the problem.
Mm-hmm.
We're too frightened to take that first step. We're too frightened to go there. We constantly hear this thing, oh, there's going to be panic in the streets, there's going to be this, there's going to be that, everybody's going to freak out. Well, okay, don't make it a statement to everybody. Handpick a group of people that is going to focus on this. Figure out first what you need. You need people who are specialists in the soft sciences, and people in all the sciences, they publish like crazy, publish or perish, right? You can go through what people have printed, what people have published, and you can figure out, okay, we need this one and this one and this one, because they're in the right direction. They're in the right track. They might be able to help us. They've got the skill set that they could bring to bear on this. Let's find a linguist who understands language, writing systems, and everything else, who understands it deeply, not just as multilingual, but understands how writing develops, how communication develops, understands about signs, making of signs, understands semiotics. Somebody with that kind of background, of course, highly specialized, maybe only a few dozen people in the world with the skill set that you need, but you could find one that you can trust, that you could swear to secrecy. You can make them sign every NDA, whatever, give them a security clearance for a special access program devoted to understanding what their sliver is, right? Because we haven't done that yet, as far as I know. Get somebody else who understands psychology, but from an evolutionary point of view, not just regular human psychology, but how does psychology develop? What things do we gain? What things do we lose? On and on. So we have the soft sciences. We could find the people just based on the publishing history. I mean, if we have AI for anything, they can do this. They can weed through thousands of scientific documents.
I have a feeling that's a big part of what the solution is, because the AI is going to correlate through vast troves of data that a human can't, and it'll find connections. It won't be able to explain why there are those connections,
right?
But it will be able to figure out, I think, more than I think we'll be surprised.
And I think we should use AI for that purpose too. We have records of sightings. We have huge databases of sightings, but they're not correlated to anything else. If we could correlate those sightings to weather conditions, to geographical conditions, right, to terrain, to what's going on in the political world at the time, or proximity to military bases, or to mine shafts, or AI could do that for us, right? Ask the right questions, you might get some interesting answers. There's a lot that can still be done, and we can do it as citizens. We don't need top secret clearance to do this.
So I know someone who's actively doing that. The hard part about that is the geocoding process.
Yeah.
It's really painstaking and painful. But so there are some barriers, not to say that they're not insurmountable. They just take a lot of time and resources. And if you kind of have a guy in his basement working with the hatch data, right, you'll be able to get some stuff, but you're not. But that's the other thing too. A lot of this data is becoming available. So there's a lot of services where you can gain access to old newspaper articles digitally.
Right.
It's all being scanned, and you can have an AI algorithm kind of absorb that, classify it, and put it into a database that can be searched by other people. But a lot of these folks are using open source materials where they could build it. But I think that's certainly one part of the question. Do you think there's anybody outside of the government that has a good idea of what's going on through direct interaction? And in other words, they're just quiet about it because they have a much better handle on the nature of reality. And we talk about, again, I'm just making this up, but some sort of group like the descendants of the Templars, or some ancient organization that follows this stuff. Do you think there's anything like that out there, or people who are somehow genetically altered to interface with whatever this is?
There are certainly a lot of people who claim that. I mean, I run into them all the time. There are groups that claim that, of course. And this is the thing.
Well, the Borderlands group, I think, are you familiar with? You have to be familiar with that group.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, they seem to be pretty close to it back in the 40s, and
but you had groups. You had UFO cults, right? You had a proliferation of them, especially in the 50s, 60s. You had a lot of that. And we laugh at them, right? They were like gullible. They believed everything. They sold their possessions. They waited for the saucer to come and take them away. And so we disregard everything about them, which might be a mistake. You know, I always think there's a lot of information there that we're overlooking because their leaders were charismatic idiots, and so they led them in the wrong direction. All kinds of
Well,
things
I mean,
happened.
take the Heaven's Gate cult, right? Like
Yeah,
those were extremely educated software engineers
yep,
and tech. Like, why would they do that? Were they that? It's hard to believe that they were that gullible. I'm not saying that they should have done that or it was the
right.
right move or anything, but what did they know that convinced them
Yeah,
to do
something they
something
knew
like that?
something, right? And they may have
Right,
interpreted completely wrongly, but
right.
they may have had a core of some data that we're missing because we tend not to look at them. You know, they did this. They killed themselves in these numbers and everything. It was so weird and so ritualistic, and our knee-jerk reaction is, "Oh, weird cult, forget them." Right?
Right.
I've gone through some of the Heaven's Gate material. It's still around. You can still find the Heaven's Gate
Oh,
stuff
I had no
around.
idea. I just used that as a for instance. Say more,
But,
please.
but there is,
Yeah.
yeah. So you can go and look at the stuff, and there was a kind of sophisticated approach to this whole thing that they had that made you think that they were onto something somehow. That maybe they had
Mhm.
one piece of something that generated all this interest and activity and this hysteria almost over it. Yeah, there were some really, mother and father, right, of the Heaven's Gate group, very strange individuals. The
Right.
whole thing was very strange. But then the data that
Chemical
we
chemical
look at,
sterilization and
yeah,
castration, like just
yeah,
weird. Yeah.
oh yeah. But then you ask yourself why, you know? There were people that did this in ancient times. There were people that castrated themselves for the gods. What was
Mhm.
the motivation for that? It wasn't just ideological. There was some method, some process, some understanding, probably twisted, probably wrong, probably
Mhm.
without the benefit of deeper science, but there was something they were focused on, something they were trying to accomplish. And this was the closest they could get to it. Like talking about the person you mentioned towards the beginning, the doctor who was investigating the schizophrenics, right?
Yeah, he's not a doctor. He's just a psychoanalyst. His name is
Psychoanalyst.
Jerry Marzinski. Yeah.
So he's looking at schizophrenia, which is a fascination of mine as well for a number of reasons. I was fascinated with R.D. Laing in the 60s, this guy who
Mhm.
created these. He said that, a mental breakdown was not a breakdown, it was a breakthrough. It was very 60s sort of, kind of, you're not really crazy, you're just seeing better than we are, which a lot of schizophrenics will have an,
Well, that's what
issue with.
Itzhak Bentov. You're familiar with Itzhak
Yes,
Bentov?
right. Yeah.
He's there's like an internet video where he's talking about like who are the geniuses in the in our civilization, and people are like, oh, physicists and like that. He's like, no, you'll find them in a mental institution
Right.
because they have like a wider or less of a filter on their perception of reality. Anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt. Please
No, but
continue.
you're exactly making my point. So we tend to disregard these people. And Lang, the Scottish psychiatrist, said, no, pay attention to what they're saying. Write down what they're saying because they're saying
Mhm.
something. And it's not always what you think. It's not gibberish. There's a thought process taking place. So he wrote The Politics of Experience, one of his books, which was everybody in the 60s read it. If you were there, you had a copy of it somewhere. Everybody had this sort of psychedelic cover on it. And we were all saying, yes, schizophrenia is great. It was really stupid. But at that point, though, it was like, we're taking a very fresh look at this. Insanity is not what we think it is. Schizophrenia is not what we think it is. And schizophrenia is the result of a broken heart. He said he interpreted schizophrenia as not a broken brain or a broken head, but a broken heart. And he said we have to treat these people, differently. So he created an institute where you couldn't tell the psychiatrists from the patients. There was no hierarchy there. So everybody sort of lived with everybody else, and you never
And by
knew.
the way, this guy has cured schizophrenics. Like
Well,
according to
yeah.
well, no, Morzinski. So according to traditional medicine, you can't cure them. You can only treat them with heavy
Exactly.
doses of medication. But
But that's
he's cured them. Right.
Lang also insisted that he had cured schizophrenics, right? So he was insisting that he had done that. But then when they came with the new super drugs to treat schizophrenia, the whole Lang thing fell out of favor. It's too long, it's
Hmm.
too hard, there's too many mistakes can happen, people can get hurt. So they walked away. So let's just give them a lot of drugs and problem solved, right? So yeah, I'm fascinated by it. I've read all of Lang that I could read, all his work on families, his was a very interesting guy, very different approach. And then I've been reading other writers who've been writing about schizophrenia, very positive, creative people who are. There's a Esme Wei-jin Wang, for instance, is a Chinese American novelist who wrote The Borders of Paradise, a very well written novel. But then she wrote a nonfiction book called The Collected Schizophrenias. And it's about her experience as a schizophrenic. She became schizophrenic in college, like many people do. It's the right age, about 20. And then, what she went through and how she dealt with it and all the different treatments that people gave her, different ways of trying to, different perspectives on schizophrenia. So it became interesting to me for that reason. But we're afield from what we were talking about, I guess. But the idea is
no, but I think it's all related. I think that's the whole point,
Yeah.
Peter. All this stuff is related. And I think one of the things that there's also this, we're a hyper specialized society right now. And I think to solve this problem, you need people who have specialties in multiple areas, but are not necessarily cross-functional types of people who have studied a little bit of history, but have also studied a little bit of science and physics, but they're not going to be brilliant in either, right? A jack of all trades, master of none, so to speak.
Right.
I think that's part of being able to see some of the patterns that might not appear obvious to someone who is so narrowly focused that everything they see is part of string theory, or everything they see is part of a religious experience, or I think, as you alluded to at the very beginning, everything is some sort of literary critique that they can write a paper about.
Right.
So anyway, so continue your thread. I didn't mean to interrupt. I think you are talking about schizophrenia. I think is perfectly relevant. I think it's just another aspect. We think we have everything figured out, but we really don't.
Well, we have, on the one side, we have schizophrenia, which we're afraid to talk about because it's very scary. And on the other side, though, we have everybody taking ayahuasca, right, and trying to have, drug-induced hallucinations and dreams, which is going to lead them to deeper understandings or lead them to be in communication with the Space Brothers or something. So you still have this idea we're deranging our senses. As the poet Rimbaud told us we had to do. We have to derange the senses in order to become poets, in order to see what the truth is. So the schizophrenic has their senses already deranged, right? And they don't know what to do with it. I mean, that's by definition. But the person who's dropping acid or taking ayahuasca or mushrooms, it's in a controlled situation, right? I'm going to be out of my mind for 8 or 12 hours or so, and I'm going to see what that produces. Right. That's one way of looking at this. It's going to be very subjective. But I found, and I did take mushrooms once or twice, I found that once or twice is enough. It's more than enough. And that what it does is it trains you. It reveals to you the fact that your senses are very unreliable. The lack of reliability of your senses, I think, was the best revelation that I took away from that. Because when you're hearing things move, or you're seeing sounds, or because of the nervous system has been thrown out of whack a little bit, but now you're experiencing a different reality. In my case, at one point I had a framed Tibetan tanka on the wall, one of these elaborate diagrams of a Buddha in the middle dancing on a lotus, and all these other Buddhas around, and all kinds of colors, a riot of colors and things. And suddenly I looked up at that diagram, and it was all completely in motion. And I thought to myself, that's what the artist meant us to see, was all of this motion. Couldn't do it in 2 dimensions, couldn't do it with a line drawing. But now I'm seeing them all moving. The god in the middle is dancing on the lotus. The other gods are talking, they're moving around, they're doing this, but all within that frame, right? All within that structure. They were constrained by the structure, even as my mind was no longer constrained by it. The beings on that diagram were constrained. They were doing things in their space. It wasn't a riot of nonsense. They were all doing things. They were all in communication, and I felt that this is how I was meant to see it. So my point is that this controlled approach is very good. You can learn something once or twice. If you're doing like hundreds of acid drops or something, you're not learning anything anymore. Basically,
Sometimes you can bring something back, though. That's the other thing that people don't talk about with these things,
oh yeah,
right?
you can, sure.
It's not often, but it sounds like some people just
Yep,
don't take well to it.
don't take well to it at all, right? Well, as they say, once a philosopher, twice a pervert, right? So you just drop acid once under controlled circumstances and then walk away. Make notes of what happened and think about it later, and just don't go back there anymore. So, but schizophrenia, of course, is the problem. You can't do anything about it, or we think we can't, because we haven't gone enough schizophrenic ourselves to understand how to talk or communicate with the schizophrenic, which is what Lang
Well,
was trying to tell us to do.
yeah, even traditional medical science. So again, I go back to Jerry Mrzinski. There was never any curiosity in any of the schooling he had, and I think he,
Mhm.
had a master's degree, got as far as kind of second year PhD program, but never once did they ever talk about what the voices were saying, what the
No.
hallucinations were about. It's always about, they're just seeing hallucinations. They don't have a good hold on reality. Just prescribe them with medication, and you can never make it quite go away, but you can basically drug them into oblivion.
Hmm.
And some of the techniques that he would try, he just would run kind of. Again, he was walking a tightrope, because if any of this got out, that he was quote unquote indulging their
Hmm.
schizophrenia, or at least that's how it would be perceived, he'd be done. So he
Right.
was very careful when he was at a traditional medical or mental institution, but then he was, got a job at a prison, and they didn't care. It was the devil's playground. Like, I don't
Right.
care if you're hearing voices. I don't, just don't stab anybody. So he would spend
Right.
hours talking to these people, and eventually people would show up to him in his office and say things like, "They want to talk to you." And he's just like, "What?" The voices have a
Hmm.
message for you. And
Hmm.
and he almost fell out his chair, because one of them said, "Okay, well, what's the message? Your message, like, don't mess with our way of life." And it's like, what? So it could be it could be a insane
Well,
delusion, sure, but one of the things was he
mhm.
would he would try certain things. He would have his patients do certain things. Things would work, things wouldn't, right? So he would ask them to do some traditional things, like if you hear the voices, just tell yourself they're not real, right? That apparently made the voices even worse. And what he would find is
Right.
that when his patients would hear these voices, they would always feel extremely drained afterward. It was almost like the voices were creating a mental environment where the people experiencing them were creating a lot of negative emotional energy. And it was
Hmm.
if whatever the source of these thoughts were feeding off of them. Okay, so you could call it demonic. You could also call it, maybe it's some sort of parasitic organism that is
Hmm.
non corporeal, or who knows. But whatever he was doing, these voices consistently did not take well to him. They hated him.
Right.
And if you're, imagine you're dealing with another species and you're messing with their food source. Additionally,
Right.
most of the people who would experience this tended to have a history of trauma, right? It's like, imagine a predator in an environment. The predator's not going to go after the strongest member of the herd. They're going to
Right.
pick at the weaker members.
Hmm.
So anyway, I don't know what these things are, and I'm very willing to accept that maybe it is being generated in that person's own mind, but I think there's a whole revolution in consciousness that we have to start thinking about. Like, where do your thoughts come from? Are you the source of all your thoughts? Or are your thoughts, is your mind an antenna, like a
Hmm.
radio station, and it's getting all sorts of thoughts from the environment, from different entities that we don't see, from other people, right? I mean, you've been in that, where you walked into a room and you can instantly tell what the mood is,
Right.
right? You just feel it, right?
Yep.
So I think we still have a long, long way to go in understanding. But I think this is all related. I think you take the Hernandez case, right, where he saw a wheel in the sky,
Hmm.
where it had remote viewing, the UFO experience, out of body, all that stuff, and it was kind of the message he received was, it's all the same. It's all the same thing.
Mhm.
I don't know. What do you think of all that? I threw a lot at you right there.
No, I'm grokking all of it. Yeah, it's sure. I mean, that's especially when we're talking about mental states like that. You know, the magicians of the Middle Ages, for instance. Let's think of the typical idea
Mm-hmm.
of a magician. I mean, in modern context, these guys were crazy, right? I mean, they're talking to things that are not there. Not only are they talking to them, they assume that they exist and that they have a technology for finding, making them show up and making them do things. I mean, it sounds insane, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you just extract it, just take it out of its context and just put it like in the modern day context, somebody sits in their room, draws a circle on the floor, you know, has incantations in languages they probably don't understand. And they believe that if they do this the right way, facing maybe the right direction and burning the right candle and the right incense, and something's going to happen and this thing is going to materialize. This is insane. This is like the definition of insanity, right? And yet they turned it into a technology, turned it into a process that persisted and persisted and persisted. You know, I mean, Dee and Kelly are a good example of this. There's Dr.
Mm-hmm.
John Dee, a very famous intellectual of the Elizabethan era. This guy was no
Mm-hmm.
slouch. He wrote the introduction to the first English translation of Euclid, right? This guy was
Mm-hmm.
understood geometry, understood math very well. And yet he was talking to angelic forces through a magic mirror and received an entire new language with an alphabet and a vocabulary and grammar and everything else that he used to talk to the angels back and forth. This
Is
is
this
like
Enochian?
Enochian, right? The so-called angelic language, Enochian. It's a highly articulated language. And we're told that it's impossible for a human being on their own to create a language out of whole cloth.
Mm-hmm.
But it looks like Dee did it somehow, right? And he had not only the language and the alphabet and all of this, but he had hundreds and hundreds of diagrams, charts that are incomprehensible to us today for mapping out where they are and how to find them, how to locate them. So, we live in this field that we're talking about, that we're discussing. We live on that knife's edge in this liminal space, between the real world that everybody feels comfortable discussing and this other world that has such an inordinate influence over the real world that we try to blind ourselves to it because it's too heavy to look at. And so is a medieval magician a kind of mental patient, from modern day concept, by doing all of this? Because that means that the people today that are doing this, are basically imitating the actions and the words and the mentality of a person who is mentally ill. Or is it the other way around, right? Or are we putting the emphasis in the wrong place? If we think that this person is mentally ill, we're the ones who are having issues. We're the ones who are not understanding what's really taking place. We deny it. We say it didn't happen. It doesn't work. It reminds me of the Soviet general for the last years of the Soviet Union at a missile base. Every time they would have a major troop movement, a UFO would show up and would just show up because they saw all the trucks and the tanks and everything moving. And he got this idea that let's provoke it. Maybe it's a cause and effect relationship.
Mm-hmm.
So he would just order a troop movement for no particular reason, just to see what would happen.
Did
And
he
the
have
thing would
nuclear
show
material
up.
with it?
Oh yeah, big time,
Yeah,
nuclear missiles. So he would do this and they would show up. And he said, okay, now let me try this. Then he would raise his hands in the air, make a gesture, and do something like that, and wave like this, right? The UFO would then move in that direction. And then he would take his arms and move in this direction, and the UFO would follow suit. And he said he was communicating with the UFO. This is a report published in the Russian press, in the Soviet press, which means a tightly controlled, censored
TASS. Yeah, TASS. And they don't just
TASS or
anything.
Pravda or something. And it was
Right,
it was being, there it was, right? And I'm reading this thing, I'm thinking, well, he's, he took a little step outside his comfort zone and said, let me just try this and see what happens. Whereas at our missile bases, we freak out and we're hitting buttons like crazy trying to stop a launch, and This guy said, let me talk to the UFO. Let me see if there's some way that they're going to see me and I can see them. And maybe we're going to, it was like the end of Close Encounters of the Third Kind with the, the gestures and the sounds and everything. The same kind of idea was taking place there. So that looks like a crazy guy, a Soviet general standing outside of a missile base, making sign language gestures at a UFO. That doesn't all go together. That should not happen, right, in our world. But it does. And if that happens, maybe magic happens. Maybe ceremonial magic is real. Maybe ritual magic is real. Maybe these things are gateways to a way of understanding and communicating in a world that we've lost, that we've suppressed or repressed because of science, because we're so comfortable with science right now that the rest of it is just making us feel uncomfortable, like a schizophrenic in the room.
It could still be, it's not necessarily inconsistent with science. It could just be a far more advanced understanding of science would get us in that direction. So let's say you take the ceremonial magic example, right? Like you and I sitting in these chairs, 99.999% of us is empty space. Mm-hmm. Right? We're just quarks vibrating at a certain frequency, electrons vibrating, a kind of step down frequency all the way up to DNA. And then that makes us, we have bacteria that makes up our gut biome, all sorts of things. So we're an amalgamation of trillions of organisms that are all operating as one. So, again, I'm no expert in ritual, but I would imagine there's something to do with rhythm and sound and vibration, right? And I think part of that is you're maybe manipulating that sort of thing. And you take the double slit experiment, right, where you're literally able to concretize reality by just observing the thing hit the pane, right? If you don't observe it, you just get a probability distribution, right? Of probability. So there's some mechanism that we still don't quite understand. Now, if I were super cynical, I could say, well, it's all simulation and we're just getting what we want to get, or want to see. Yeah. And there could be some aspects of that that's actually true, where you talk to people who have near-death experiences and they talk about, or Elizabeth Cannon, right, I think, right, who talks about Earth as a school, right? Again, I have no idea what how to take that, but I think there's as you peel back the onion, there's infinite complexity at the micro scale, and there's also infinite complexity at the macro scale. And I think that's just, the deeper you dive, the more that these, mysteries keep happening. But there's some force out there. There's something guiding these interactions. But you were talking about ritual magic and how, that could also be part of a reality that we're avoiding. If you could say more about that, I think that's an interesting thread.
Yeah, I mean, ritual magic, if it's done correctly, the whole point is to.
Oh, by the way, it's Dolores Canyon. I'm being corrected. Thank you, Chester. I actually appreciate the correction. Yeah, let's make sure that
Dolores
we put out bad stuff. Yeah.
In a ritual environment, you basically created a sensory deprivation chamber. Because what you're trying to do is, in the very basic sort of rituals that the Golden Dawn, for instance, developed, if you're going to invoke a spirit of Mars, which is the example people use a lot, the planet Mars, or some spiritual force that we associate with the planet Mars, everything is red, right? So there's red candles, and there's specific incenses, perfumes that are associated in the popular mind with Mars. Vestments, if you're wearing robes, they're red. Everything is done with the symbol of the Mars angelic force, or whatever it happens to be, a planetary force is written. Everything else is out. In other words, there's no yellow, blues, there's no anything else. Everything is focused towards one kind of experience. And then the incantation is directed towards this experience. So you've actually created a sensory deprivation chamber with one major difference. And that one sense is allowed in, right? It's not a complete blank slate. It's a blank slate, but with one color, one concept that's there apart from everything else. So all of your senses now are focused on this one concept. Nothing else is allowed there. And that's what allows the breakthrough to happen. It's like a person with a mental disorder having this idée fixe, right? This fixed idea. This is this one thing they're always talking about, constantly thinking and talking about. Nothing else exists. You're doing that to yourself temporarily. You're actually experimenting with different mental states when you're performing ritual magic. And some of these mental states are considered, illnesses, right? By medical science. Hallucinations is one good example. You're actually provoking a hallucination. It could be auditory, it could be visual, it could be both, right? And the magicians experienced both of these sensations.
But the
They
question though
heard
is the
voices.
hallucination. If the hallucination has no pattern, then it's not really a hallucination. That's the other thing. Like, we're sorry.
Well,
If the a hallucination typically has no pattern.
right.
But if what you're hearing has a pattern, it might not necessarily be a
It'd be a
hallucination.
hallucination. Yeah.
It
So
might
that's what
not
you're.
necessarily be a hallucination, right?
And so here you had John D, and his partner Kelly, and they're seeing hallucinations. They are provoking these hallucinations. To a modern scientist, they say, well, these guys are hallucinating, right? They're seeing angels. The angels are pointing at tablets. They're pointing at letters. They're communicating these things. They're writing down these charts. This is like an elaborate hallucination. The other way of looking at it, the way a lot of people do, these guys were just charlatans. They were trying to fool people. But they didn't. They were doing this to themselves, right? Most of the stuff was not printed while they were alive. This was like found out later, printed and published later. I mean, all of these materials, not everything has been published even today. So it wasn't like they were out there trying to bamboozle people with a rabbit in a hat trick or something. These were like very serious people. Their lives were at stake with this. They had all sorts of hardships. D came back and found that they had burned his house down because they thought he was a witch or something. I mean, this was not like he wasn't making money at this, is what I'm trying to say. This wasn't like some sort of a hoax that he was perpetrating on the masses. This guy was intense. He was focused on this. And he was, as I say, a respected academic at the time as well. So you're flirting with madness. You're flirting with this. But it's kind of necessary to do that to understand madness in the first place, as Lang kept telling us. But it's also necessary to understand consciousness itself, to understand what's happening. When we see a UFO, as an example, are we hallucinating, right? Maybe there's a midway point there. Maybe what we're seeing is not there. What's really
it's a representation
there,
of something.
It's a representation.
Right.
It's an icon of some kind. It's like an icon on our computer screen. It's not really there, but it has function and it means something, right? And one day it's an airship, and the next day it's a round saucer, or maybe it's the Horton brothers flying disc, or something much more elaborate, like the end of CE3K, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. Maybe something like that with colors and lights and sounds. Who knows? Maybe these are all just representations. If so, it's communicating to something in here. It's plucking something out, like my experience with that Men in Black episode.
Right. It's in your head.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're putting it out there. They're saying, ha, we can see inside you. We can pick what we want, and you're going to see what we want you to see. It's going to be something you've already seen. And that's going to confuse the hell out of you. And that's what this is all about.
So any final words, Peter, for the audience?
Pleasant dreams.
Well, pleasant dreams, dreams, right? You start covering this stuff, you start to have weird dreams. I'll tell you that.
Well, I made this tweet once. I said that, imagine one day we're all going to wake up after having had the same dream, which is kind of a Lovecraftian thing, that Cthulhu is sending dreams to, the dreamers. But then there was this mathematician called Grothendieck, a very famous award-winning mathematician, Belgian mathematician. And I write about him in one of the novels that I wrote. And Grothendieck went kind of crazy. He was this brilliant mathematician. Algebraic geometry was his field, and he's kind of lost it. And he wrote this elaborate treatise on the dream and the dreamer. He says your dreams come from the dreamer, like the dreamer was out there somewhere, and your dreams came from someplace else. And this elaborate thing, and he went kind of a little crazy. He lived as a recluse in the south of France somewhere, and died without ever having come back into the academic fold. He had given up on math entirely. and become a kind of weird mystic. So the dream and the dreamer, we don't know where the dream comes from, really. We think we do because the dreams look familiar, but then the UFOs do too. So we don't know who's dreaming whom.
And who knows if the reality is not just a dream from projected from a hyperdimensional being, right? Who knows?
Mhm.
So
Right.
anyway, a pleasure, my friend, as always.
Pleasure is mine.
Thank you very much.
Thank
All
you.
right. Thank you, everyone, for listening, and tune in next week and speak soon.